about all kinds of stuff. Professor Dave explains.
Though any study of an ancient civilization will rely at least in part on material evidence, or the physical remains indicating how people lived, worked, ate, and fought, the farther back we go in time, the less written information we have to help us understand their thoughts and priorities. The civilizations of Mesopotamia were among the first to have their own system of writing, and they made a strong impression on cultures like the Greeks, who many centuries later wrote about the Assyrians and the Babylonians because they viewed them as fabled societies of the past. But the Greeks were only familiar with the final years of a much longer history, which they knew nothing about except through legends that had sprung up in the many years since. And because Mesopotamian civilization had been thriving for centuries by the time the art of writing developed, our picture of it still relies heavily on the findings of archaeology. The name Assyria, as the description of a nation and an empire, began with the Semitic city-state of Assur in Upper Mesopotamia, which was one of a number of cities in that region that had originally been independent states organized around a temple, in this case the temple of the god Ashur, after whom it was named. By the time we encounter it in the historical record, during the early part of the 3rd millennium BCE, it was part of the sphere of influence of the Sumerian cities of Lower Mesopotamia, but then, along with Sumer itself, it became a part of the Akkadian Empire that united the entire region under Sargon the Great, around 2200 BCE. The inhabitants of both Assur and Akkad, located in central Mesopotamia, spoke Akkadian and were part of the same ethnic group, though Assur was a wetter and grassier region than the territories to the south, and did not need to rely on irrigation. In fact, the lists of Assyrian kings, recorded centuries later, describe its first rulers as kings who lived in tents. This suggests that they were shepherds with open pastures rather than settled farmers. Assur became an important northern outpost of this empire, and it had trade relations with the nearby Hittite Empire in Asia Minor. The Assyrians became independent again after Akkad was invaded by Gutians from the north in the 22nd century BCE, and was once again a province of Ur during its revival in the 21st. After this revival came to an end, Assur began to develop as an independent state. Its first known king, who was named Ushpia, dedicated a temple to the god Ashur just as other kings of the region did for the gods of their own cities. Around 2025 BCE, his successor, Puzur-Ashur, established trading colonies called Karu in Anatolia to the north, the most important of which was called Kanesh. Goods were brought there for sale, and despite the absence of money in the modern sense, the merchants who lived there banded together to finance caravans from the south, with the promise of receiving shares in any eventual profits. In the early 20th century, King Ilu Shuma brought troops to southern Mesopotamia to protect it from the Amorites, who were migrants from the coast of Syria that had gained control of the Sumerian territory to the south, or possibly from the Elamites, who were moving in from Iran to the east. He was followed by King Ereshum, who expanded trade with the north, kept many written records, and built new temples for Ashur, the goddess Ishtar, and the storm god Adad. At the end of the 19th century, this dynasty was replaced by a new Amorite king named Shamshi-adad. He expanded the Assyrian Empire, while in Assur itself he built a large palace and added a ziggurat to the temple of Ashur. The ziggurats were not temples, but graduated platforms that were intended to reach the divine realm, and their summits held shrines, to which the public did not have access, where priests could serve their gods. After Shamshi-Adad's death, the empire was brought to a temporary end by Hammurabi, who was the first powerful king of the city of Babylon, which had not until then played an important role in the region. This Babylonian regime did not last, and around 1720 BCE, a king named Adasi founded a new Assyrian dynasty. This was a period of prosperity and political security that lasted through the 16th century BCE. In the 15th, Assyria entered into an alliance with Egypt against the expanding Mitanni Empire in Anatolia, which was defeated and had to pay tribute for decades afterward. The 14th through 11th centuries BCE are considered the middle period of the Assyrian Empire, when it defeated the Mitanni, took over part of the Hittite Empire, and surpassed the power of Egypt and Babylonia. Many of the cuneiform texts from this era are the accounts of kings who boast about their decisive victories over the neighboring kingdoms. This is why our picture of the Middle Empire leans heavily toward military accomplishments, which may have been less impressive and decisive than our sources make them out to be. Four of the important kings of this period were adad-nirari I, Shalmaneser I, Tukulti-ninurta, and Tiglath-pileser I. Adad-nirari, who had a long reign at the beginning of the 13th century BCE, defeated the Mitanni and the Babylonians, and we know from his correspondence with the ruler of the Hittite Empire that he represented himself as no less powerful than his neighbors. By moving the defeated Mitanni from their homeland and replacing them with Assyrians, he instituted the policy of mass deportation of defeated peoples, which would become typical of Assyria in the centuries that followed. It's even referred to in the Bible, where the Jews who have returned from their exile in Babylon are confronted with people who had been settled there by the Assyrians when they defeated the northern kingdom of Israel 150 years before. The visual description of deportees in Assyrian reliefs suggests that they were treated reasonably well, since they are portrayed as families traveling on vehicles rather than captives led in chains. In the middle of the 13th century BCE, Adad-nirari's son, Shalmaneser, conquered the kingdom of Urartu in the Caucasus Mountains and defeated both the Hittites and the Mitanni. He also expanded the cities of Assur and Nineveh. In turn, his son, Tukulti-ninurta, defeated the Hittites and conquered Babylon. Although the city had already been dominated by his predecessors, he destroyed its walls and pillaged its temples, including the statue of its chief god Marduk, which was in the Isagala temple. He deported its king and part of its people to Assyria. He also conquered the southern regions of the Arabian Peninsula. But he was assassinated, and it's been suggested that he had been at odds with the priests of Ashur, who were a powerful clique during this period. During a 40-year career that spanned the late 12th and early 11th centuries BCE, Tiglath-pileser I conquered large parts of Asia Minor and Syria, as well as the Canaanites and Phoenicians on the Mediterranean coast. He also restored the temples of Ashur and Hadad, built a new palace, assembled a library of cuneiform tablets, and issued a set of laws. The documents of this era suggest that the military was a privileged institution. Service was obligatory, and a premium was placed on breeding the horses which were used in chariot warfare. All this was at a time when many of the empires in the region were either collapsing or suffering serious setbacks in what is now known as the Bronze Age collapse. While Egypt was invaded by what it called Sea Peoples, the Hittite Empire and the Mycenaean and Minoan civilizations came to an end. There were also population movements within Greece and in Canaan, but although the Assyrian Empire contracted somewhat during the 11th century, it did not suffer this kind of dislocation and continued to thrive within its smaller borders. In addition to military conquest and territorial expansion, the Middle Assyrian Empire is known for its legal codes, which appeared in the time of Tiglath-pileser I. Like the Code of Hammurabi and other Mesopotamian codes of the time, they dealt with people of inferior legal status, such as women and slaves, and with various kinds of offenses against people and properties, but their penalties were harsher than those found in the other codes. This was also the period when the carved reliefs, that are now closely identified with Assyrian palaces, first developed. These were visual narratives that portrayed scenes like hunts, battles, and religious processions in sequential order, with cuneiform captions to identify people, places, and actions. These reliefs were often accompanied by large figures called lamassu, which were creatures with the body of a lion or a bull, the head of a man, and the wings of a large bird. They were carved on the stone doorposts of palace chambers to give them both width and length, and they were meant to protect the residents. The 300 years between the 10th and 7th centuries BCE were a time when Assyria experienced a resurgence, until it was finally defeated by an alliance of its neighbors. This period, which is now referred to as the Neo-Assyrian Empire, began with Adad-nirari II in 911 BCE, who extended his borders into Anatolia, Babylonia, and the coast of Syria. The kings of this period acquired a reputation, deserved or not, for savagery against their enemies. Shalmaneser claimed to have blinded 14,000 prisoners in one eye, while Adad-nirari's successor, Ashurnasirpal II, who reigned from 883 to 859 BCE, recorded the following on one of his monuments. "Of some I cut off their feet and hands. Of others I cut off their ears, noses, and lips. Of the young men's ears I made a heap. Of the old men's heads I made a minaret. The male children and female children I burned in the flames of the city." The palace built by Ashurnasirpal at Nimrud when he made it his new capital is famous for its stone reliefs, which include several scenes of battle and conquest rendered in graphic detail. They also illustrate the siege machines for which the empire was famous. Towards the end of the 9th century, there was a period of several years when the empire was ruled by a queen named Shamuramat, after her husband the king had died, and before her son was old enough to take the throne. Her success in this role, which was unique, assured her a place in later legend, when the Greeks and Romans, who called her Semiramis, made her into the wife of the mythical king Ninus, who they believed was the founder of the city of Nineveh. A lack of pertinent information seems to have led these writers to push what was for them the relatively recent history of the late Assyrian Empire back to the age of myth. In the mid-8th century, King Tiglath-pileser III created for the first time a professional army which included archers, slingers, charioteers, and siege machines that could assault the walls of cities with stones and battering rams. There were also sappers, whose job was to dig beneath the walls in order to help bring them down. He and his successors also made extensive use of iron, which was not yet common, in weapons such as swords, javelins, arrowheads, and sling bullets, as well as in their armor and shields. Tiglath-pileser deported several of the tribes of the northern kingdom of Israel as a punishment for rebellion and replaced its king with an ally. He also conquered the coastal cities north of Egypt, the island of Cyprus, and Babylonia itself. At the end of that century, Sargon II and his son Sennacherib put an end to Israel and deported most of its inhabitants, who became the basis of the legendary 10 Lost Tribes, and he broke off his invasion of the southern kingdom of Judah only because its king paid him a huge bribe and submitted to becoming an Assyrian vassal state. Sennacherib also moved the capital to Nineveh. It had around 150,000 inhabitants, making it one of the largest cities of the time. Though it had been part of Assyria for hundreds of years, and had been expanded by the kings of the new empire since the early 9th century BCE, it was Sennacherib who extended the city's street plan and built an enormous new palace, whose construction process is depicted on the reliefs decorating its walls. As the palace was built at the time of Sennacherib's invasion of the two Israelite kingdoms, the most famous of these reliefs depicts the siege of the Israelite city of Lachish. The gardens that Sennacherib created in Nineveh may also have inspired the story of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, which were considered one of the 7 wonders of the world. The Nineveh palace was the site of the cuneiform tablets collected by Ashurbanipal, who reigned from 669 to 627 BCE. He had been trained as a scribe, and as king he pressured the territories under his control to send him their records and literature. He was particularly interested in magical spells, but the collection, which is now described as the world's first library, contained law codes, treaties, scientific texts, religious hymns, correspondence, and literature, which was organized by subject matter. It is the source of the 2 most famous works of Mesopotamian literature, the Enuma Elish, which is a Babylonian creation story, and the Epic of Gilgamesh, which began as a Sumerian story but was adopted by the Akkadians as well. Both of these works bear similarities to the Israelite mythology recorded in the book of Genesis, which was first composed around the time that the Israelites were in exile in Mesopotamia. Though these texts were recorded in Akkadian, which was the Assyrians' traditional language, by the 8th century BCE, the empire was using Aramaic, another Semitic language which was spoken by many of its inhabitants, as their language of administration. This may have had something to do with the fact that the Assyrians' policy of resettling the populations of conquered territories had introduced Aramaic to a much larger area of their domain. Aramaic was also much easier to write than Akkadian because it made use of a version of the 22-letter alphabet of the Phoenicians, while Akkadian, for reasons of tradition, continued to be written until the time of the Roman Empire in the syllabic characters of cuneiform. During the reign of Ashurbanipal, the Assyrian Empire reached its largest territorial extent, but after his death in 627 BCE, a conflict arose over the succession to his throne. The Babylonians, under Nabal-Polassar, took advantage of this to rebel against Assyria, and Egypt broke away as well. Scythians then came from the Black Sea to raid Asia Minor, and the Medes and Persians in Iran attacked at the same time as the others, though not in coordination with them. However, this changed in 612 BCE when the Medes and the Persians, the Babylonians, and the Scythians all besieged and destroyed the capital of Nineveh. In 609, what remained of the empire became part of the territory of the Medes. About 50 years after that, Cyrus the Great conquered the Medes and founded the Achaemenid dynasty, a Persian kingdom that lasted until it was defeated by Alexander the Great in the 4th century BCE. Assyria then became a part of this kingdom and was never again an independent state. Let's now continue by getting a closer look at the Babylonian Empire.
Thanks for watching. Subscribe to my channel for more tutorials. Support me on Patreon so I can keep making content. And as always, feel free to email me, ProfessorDaveExplains@gmail.com.